The jungle was silent save for the birds chirping in the distance. The ruins of an ancient temple, long claimed by vines and time, loomed in the clearing. And that's when they saw it, half buried in the rubble, glinting in the afternoon sun. A skull. Not bone, but crystal. 17-year-old Anna Mitchell Hedges reached down, brushing away the dirt. It was impossibly smooth, unnervingly clear, and carved with a precision that should not have been possible centuries ago. This thing shouldn't exist, and yet there it was, staring back at her, and for decades, whispers followed it. Some claimed it was an ancient relic of lost knowledge, while others will go on to say it's a cursed artifact linked to sickness and even death. But the biggest question remained: who could have made this thing? And more importantly, why? Unbeknownst to Anna, decades earlier, in the late 1800s, deep inside a European library, a German scholar is hunched over the fragile pages of an ancient Maya manuscript, the Dresden Codex. It was filled with celestial charts, ritual calendars, and depictions of destruction. Then he saw them. Skulls. Ornate skulls everywhere. Some believed they were symbolic of Maya gods of death and prophecy, but others would come to insist that this book held a warning about 13 skulls scattered across the world, holding lost knowledge beyond human comprehension. What secrets do these crystal skulls hold, and exactly who was behind making them? Well, that's the mystery we're going to dive into, and I think you're going to like this one, so let's move on. The Dresden Codex is one of the last surviving Maya manuscripts. It's believed that it's actually a copy of even older texts, dating back thousands of years. It's filled with eerie prophecies, celestial alignments, and warnings of destruction, like predictions of floods, famine, and sickness. There's even rituals tied to death and rebirth. And then there are skulls, lots of them. Among its cryptic illustrations, certain images stand out. Skulls alongside symbols of destruction and chaos. Some believe these are not ordinary skulls, but references to 13 crystal artifacts lost to time, meant to hold knowledge beyond human comprehension. Could the Dresden Codex have actually been a warning? The first crystal skulls surfaced in the late 19th century, not in documented digs, but quietly appearing in private collections, their origins unknown. The most famous, the Mitchell Hedges skull, was allegedly found in 1924 at the ruins of Louboutin, Belize. Anna had actually went to Belize on an archaeological dig with her famous father, F.A. Mitchell Hedges, who was a well-known scientist, and it's actually said that the character Indiana Jones was based off of this guy. So these guys were the real deal. According to the story, Anna Mitchell Hedges saw something glinting beneath a collapsed altar. It was a perfectly clear skull, impossibly smooth, and made with no tool marks. Local elders, Mitchell Hedges would go on to claim, recognized it immediately. They would go on to call it a sacred object and said it was tied to a prophecy, holding a power beyond human comprehension. Other skulls would start to appear, such as those housed in the British Museum and others in Paris, and with them emerged similar unverifiable histories. Some who handled them reported visions, hallucinations, and even unexplained illnesses. At least 13 of these skulls did appear over time. Some people say are forgeries, while others people say are the real deal. So were these relics of a lost civilization, a message from the gods, or is there a final warning for the human race encoded in the Maya's last surviving books and these artifacts? And if 13 were meant to be found, what actually would happen if they're finally brought together? I just want to thank you for joining in today's episode. If you like it, hit that like button or consider subscribing to the channel. It really helps us know whether or not to make more of this content. I won't keep you any longer. So with that, let's just move on. For years, the crystal skulls remained unexplained relics, until some researchers turned to the Dresden Codex for answers. Among its skull imagery, the celestial charts, and the cryptic glyphs, people claim to have found veiled references to 13 sacred artifacts. Some would point to a 19th century German translation of the Codex, where they believe it mentions sacred skulls and an impending event. By the 1970s and 80s, the legend would spread even further. Writers like Frank Dorlin, Josh Shapiro, and Nick Nocerino would argue that the skulls were much more than relics. they stored ancient energy. They were waiting to be unlocked, almost like a computer. Spiritual leaders will go on to claim that the skulls were meant to be reunited in order to awaken a lost ancient wisdom. And by the early 2000s, figures would go on to claim that the skulls were directly linked to the Dresden Codex. They were a warning, and they have to be brought together before December 21st, 2012, which is famously or infamously the end of the Maya calendar, which many believe would be the start of the apocalypse. The crystal skulls were no longer just artifacts. These were keys to a prophecy that seemed to be tied to the fate of humanity. And from here, the legend would actually take an even darker turn, because some who possessed the skulls claimed to hear voices, while others would say it carried a curse. The Mitchell Hedges skull, which is often dubbed the Skull of Doom, a name that only added to its legend. Some would go on to claim that this thing is discovered in 1924, held supernatural properties. And Anna Mitchell Hedges, she would go on to become the skull's most vocal keeper. For decades, Anna warned that the skull was dangerous, claiming those who stared into its hollow eyes for too long risked falling ill or even worse. Some visitors who went to go see the skull reported whispers when alone with it. They said that there was voices calling their names. Some would describe visions, flashes of ancient civilizations, unknown symbols, and even ghostly faces. One researcher, Frank Dorland, studied the skull for years, but that is until his sudden death, which some believe is linked to its ancient curse. Then there's the British Museum skull, which was acquired in 1897 in a collection. It's believed that it was originally from Mexico, but unlike the Mitchell Hedges skull, which has a dramatic discovery story, the British Museum skull was simply purchased from a collector with no known origin. Yet it had the same dark reputation. Museum staff and visitors reported that electronics were short-circuiting near the skull, even in controlled conditions. They reported intense headaches and dizziness after prolonged exposure. It even got to the point that some staff refused to be in the same room with it. So with the crystal skulls that have popped up around the world, they all share the similar properties, in that they're really old and they were made with tools that are of such high precision, it doesn't make sense that any known civilization prior to kind of modern day humans could have made them. And then you have the Paris skull, and it's housed in a museum again in France, and people around it report strange disturbances and similar symptoms to the skull in Britain. However, a lot of people actually say that the skull in Paris shouldn't belong in this collection and it's actually a forgery. But whether it is or not doesn't really seem to matter, because by the early 2000s, this legend was no longer just about the skulls themselves. It took on a more cosmic purpose, in that people started to believe this was linked to the Mayan calendar and essentially a prediction of the end of the world that would come around 2012. And some of these newer age believers fully embraced the idea that the 13 crystal skull prophecy was as real as it gets, claiming that these skulls really had to be brought together before December 21, 2012. One of the key figures in this movement was Hunspatz Men, who is a Yucatec Maya spiritual teacher. And in 2011, he led a highly publicized pilgrimage where the group of spiritual leaders traveled across the US, carrying the crystal skulls from one sacred site to another. During each stop of the pilgrimage, there were ceremonies, meditations, and rituals, with followers believing that the skulls were truly conduits of lost wisdom, waiting to be activated. Hundreds of people gathered in locations like Sedona, Arizona, or Serpent Mound, Ohio, waiting for something supernatural to happen. Some would go on to claim they did hear voices and whispers that were definitely not human, while others say they received visions, warnings, and other imagery of impending global catastrophe. A few even swore that the skull moved, vibrated, or changed temperature in their hands. But as we know, December 21st, 2012 came and went without incident. The world kept turning. There was no cataclysm, no revelation. There was no big life-changing event that happened from bringing these skulls together during the pilgrimage. And instead of abandoning the prophecy, the believers would double down, some saying that the alignment of the skulls had set something in motion, something that we couldn't see, while others said that the warnings had just been misunderstood. So there's a lot of theories that come up over the years to try and explain exactly where this rare collection of skulls that appeared from all over the world came from, and whether or not they truly are linked to the Dresden Codex and the Mayan calendar. Well, the first theory is that, the skull prophecy is real, that these are ancient objects tied to the Dresden Codex, to the Maya, and they contain ancient knowledge that we need to save the human race. The Codex is filled with cycles of destruction, celestial warnings, and skeletal deities, and today, some of the passages still remain undeciphered. Could it be that scholars have overlooked and concealed the truth? That some alternative researchers are actually right, that the skull imagery and references to death gods are much more than just religious symbols, that they are veiled description of powerful artifacts, objects that were later uncovered as the crystal skulls? But mainstream interpretations of the Dresden Codex seem to paint a different picture. Scholars like Ernst Forstemann, who first decoded the manuscript's mathematical calendar in the 19th century, is often said to be misquoted. He simply identified that there was a mathematical calendar system and a sophisticated astronomical or ritual guide. And modern Mayan scholars agree that the Codex primarily serves as a guide to timing religious ceremonies, predicting eclipses, planetary movements, and ritual sacrifices meant to maintain cosmic balance. The skull imagery, they argue, symbolizes death gods like Apuk and the cyclical nature of destruction and rebirth, not hidden artifacts and lost relics. Despite this, believers in the skull prophecy point to untranslated glyphs, possible misinterpretation, and gaps in a scholarly understanding. If the Dresden Codex does not directly reference the crystal skulls, why is this connection persisting? Where does this prophecy truly come from? Well, some would believe that the skull prophecy is not ancient at all, and it's simply a misunderstanding that was born in Europe. In the 1800s, French artist Jean-Francois Waldeck became one of the first Europeans to actually document the Maya runes, but he was also known for embellishing his sketches, sometimes adding skull imagery where none existed. Said that he actually had obsession with the death symbolism or the Maya skulls, that he even owned a crystal skull himself. Could his artistic liberties have influenced early researchers into believing that the skulls held deep Maya significance? We do know that some of the text is a copy of older text, and around the same time, collectors in Europe and Mexico began acquiring crystal skulls from antiquities dealer, lacking any real excavation records, and some people may have just linked them to Maya by association, despite no proof that the two were ever connected. If early European scholars mistakenly assigned sacred meaning to the skulls, later generations of researchers could have built upon that misunderstanding, turning it out into a full-blown prophecy. But it's not entirely clear whether or not that's true. As with interpreting ancient texts, there's always a little bit of confusion assigned to this. The legend of 13 crystal skulls only gained widespread attention really in the 1980s, and not from archaeological discoveries, but from the New Age movement. A person named Harley Swift-Deer Reagan, who was a controversial spiritual teacher, and in the 80s, he described a vision of 12 crystal skulls forming a circle around the 13th skull. And this would eventually reveal humanity's forgotten past. But one of the problems is he preached about this as if it was part of some ancient indigenous belief, which could never be verified. And by the early 2000s, you start to see references claiming that the Dresden Codex contains hidden references to the skull. The legend was tied to the end of the Maya long count calendar in 2012, fueling belief that reuniting the skulls could prevent catastrophe. Yet, when the 2012 prophecy failed, people would start to ask questions, especially considering the origins of each skull is tangled in a mix of misinterpretation, spiritual movements, and modern mythology. For decades, believers insisted that the crystal skulls are remnants of advanced civilizations. But in the early 2000s, the British Museum and the Smithsonian subjected the crystal skulls to rigorous testing. They used electron microscopes and X-rays to determine that the skulls had been carved using modern rotary tools with high-speed abrasives and technology that didn't exist at all in Mesoamerica before the Spanish conquest. Further investigations also traced the British Museum skull and the Paris skull back to the 19th century antiquities markets. These artifacts were likely produced in Germany or France, where skilled artisans had access to high-quality quartz and modern cutting techniques. There's zero archaeological evidence linking any crystal skull to a verified pre-Columbian excavation site. And I stand by that, because even the Anna Mitchell Hedges skull, if it was real, if it was part of a true archaeological dig, why is there no records of the excavation site in Belize? Yes, that's right. Anna went there with her archaeologist father, according to her, and there's no records of this. There's no records of the dig. And F.A. Mitchell Hedges never writes about the skull, and it said that those around him says he never mentions it. Anna only starts to mention the skull later in the 1950s after he passes away. So that's definitely suspicious. As for the Dresden Codex, extensive scholarly translations confirm that there's nowhere in the text that actually references crystal skulls, relics, or a prophecy about reuniting them. The entire connection between the Codex and the skulls is a modern fabrication built on misinterpretation, artistic embellishment, and New Age mythology. So why do people still believe? Even when evidence disproves a myth, it rarely makes the story disappear. And the crystal skull legend taps into something even deeper: our love for lost knowledge, forbidden artifacts, and the idea that ancient civilizations possess wisdom beyond our understanding. And the 13 Skull prophecy aligns perfectly with themes of mysticism, hidden truths, and world-altering secrets. And unlike things that are truly a mystery, like the Voynich manuscript, which you can check out the story about that in my channel, the link's here, there really is not a lot of mystery to this to me. It just seems like this has been a perpetuated hoax of people that stood to profit off of it since these collections were formed. Even Anna Mitchell Hedges, like, I know that she was the keeper of the skull, like, she really was in a biased position. Not only did she profit, it said that she actually promoted the skull, and she was charging admission fees for the public to come and see this thing and, you know, kind of push those mystical properties as part of its marketing. So again, highly biased that any of the people or any of the events around these skulls, including the records, suggest that they ever came from an ancient site themselves. Whether or not it's true, I'll never know. But in the end, the crystal skulls may not be Maya relics or the key to lost knowledge, but they remain one of the greatest and most enduring historical hoaxes of all time. But the Dresden Codex is very real, and it is one of the last surviving records of ancient Maya. The crystal skulls, well, they are real too. There are intricately carved objects that continue to baffle and intrigue, but whether they're cursed or part of a prophecy really doesn't seem to be the case. However, you never know. No ancient texts predict the skulls, no Maya inscriptions speak of their power, yet for a century this legend has persisted, because some of the myths just seem too powerful to die. So what do you think? Is this an elaborate hoax? Is there something we don't understand? Let me know in the comments. And other than that, I'm going to be back again next week. So thanks for joining in.